Moving on to nuclear power, what's behind the increased estimates for decommissioning costs?
Was there a rise in estimates?
Yeah.
More detailed planning by the NDA as they have got on top of their mission, so they have been what they call rebaselining the plans to understand exactly what has to be done.
And how confident are we these figures are accurate?
I don't think I would say that we would expect them never to change again. I think that would be very misleading. They're a lot better than they were. But
it's gone up by 10%, isn't it?
Yes, over a period, yes it has. But we are much more confident about them than they were. We continue to work to improve them. And we also, of course, continue to work to actually make an impact into them and get on with making progress on decommissioning.
Can I just make a point on that? Because there are, I mean, it would be wrong, you know, this is a moving target. Speech I gave to the Royal Society recently gave the numbers for the increase in estimated liabilities for nuclear cleanup, which has been rising, you know, very dramatically every decade in, decade out. And we continue to have a legacy which we have not fully got to the bottom of in terms of the NDA's work. So, for example, in the Mike Wakeman's review of Fukushima, in the final report, he said very clearly that we need to proceed to deal with the ponds and silos issues at Sellafield. We still have work to do to understand exactly what is in some of those ponds and silos. So, I don't, you know, the uncertainties are continue to be substantial.
I mean, the 3 billion. Do you think it's the right level for the annual spend for the decommissioning agency?
Yes, I do. I think that the key point for me was to get across during the comprehensive spending review that everything which was really crucial to deal with was not budget constrained. So in terms of the high hazards, particularly at Sellafield, I can honestly tell you that there is no budget constraint on the work. It is proceeding as fast as it possibly could, given the constraints on the physical density of the plants in Sellafield, given the engineering constraints. It is not budget constrained. And that was a very important point for me, because I want to see this proceed as quickly as we can.
You mentioned Sellafield, the MOX plant closed in August. Do we need a new plant to manage our civil plutonium stockpile?
Well, the response on what we're going to deal with in terms of waste is certainly that one of the options would be to have a new MOX plant, because that is what will turn our very substantial stocks of plutonium into something which is rather less dangerous.
Are there any commercial? Does the department think it's a commercial thing for us to be getting into?
My fundamental, Roy will say a bit more about this, but my fundamental driver on this is it's an issue of environmental responsibility.
So we don't see, in view of the fact the Chinese are building huge numbers of nuclear power stations and others are joining the fray, that we don't think there's a commercial opportunity?
You would not build a MOX plant in order to take advantage of commercial opportunities. The argument in favour of the MOX plant is to deal with the legacy of plutonium that we have and to convert it into material which is potentially less dangerous.
Okay, on the danger front, if you
Maura, do you want to add anything on that?
I'm happy to let you carry on.
No, just on the danger front, you may recall, Secretary of State, that I mentioned a paper about the reality of Chernobyl and the effects. I don't know if you got to read it since. In view of the fact that we're sort of embarking upon new nuclear sort of power stations and the like, it strikes me that there's a need here for us to be, I don't know, you made reference to mathematics with Mr. Gardner earlier. Well, if you look at the sort of the figures with regards to Chernobyl, the risk of nuclear power is nowhere near where the public's perception is. I mean, the two are just not. You know, it's quite remarkable how people view Chernobyl as being this terrible accident that killed so many people, and yet 250,000 people died in one dam exploding in China in 1975.
Yes, and indeed, if you look at some of the studies that have been done.
So, do you think you have? I mean, first of all, from one point, I would say that Britain has a responsibility, the government has a responsibility to be clear and to be honest about the facts, the figures matter. And the second thing is that if we are concerned about this radioactivity and we don't think it's a commercial thing to manage to build a MOX plant, why on earth are we continuing French technology in terms of, I mean, I talk about thorium all the time. I don't understand why it is that we persist with creating more and more plutonium, if it is such a risk and if it is so commercially possible to process.
I mean, that would not be the case with a new generation of reactors.
But there would be a waste problem.
There will be.
And in view of the figures that we spoke about at the start,
but it will be very.
But the figures at the start are growing 10% at the moment.
Yeah, but it will be.
So are we not sort of creating a legacy for our grandchildren?
No, I think it's a very, very different one. What you have to take into account, I think, in looking back at the history of the British nuclear programme, and this is something I went into in some detail in the Royal Society speech, is that we built the world's first nuclear reactor in Calder Hall in 1956, and one of the difficulties, I think, in the economic experience of the nuclear programme is precisely that there were mixed objectives. That actually Calder Hall was not built to generate electricity alone. It was also built to produce plutonium for the weapons programme.
And that's why thorium wasn't followed up in 50s and 60s. I understand the history, Secretary of State. I'm wondering when are we actually going to sort of grasp the nettle and say, right, we want nuclear power that doesn't create waste?
Well,
when are we actually going to do it?
There is still a good deal of interest, and you raised this in the
but interest, I want action personally. I don't want interest.
Well, I don't want to sound too excessively short-termist, because actually the sort of things that we're talking about have still a span of decades rather than. But we do. I have discussed thorium with the chief scientist since we talked, and and there are a number. I mean, I'd say, judging by my postbag and by emails, there's an increasing amount of interest in thorium. In fact, I had a paper from a company in the city yesterday arguing that thorium, is very interesting as a long-term source, but it is still long-term, and it's not something that we can bank as part of our energy mix in the sort of foreseeable future that we are.
But it's long-term because we decide not to concentrate on it. At some point you have to take a punt. I mean, I was reading that article by Rachel Sylvester yesterday. I mean, Mr. Taleb is now the guru around number 10. It's black swans, isn't it? It's like these things come in big jumps. They don't evolve over time. It's big jumps. And this, potentially, thorium is a big jump.
It is potentially a big jump, but I would also just be slightly wary, because I can remember years and years ago, since I cut my teeth fighting a parliamentary seat back in the 1980s, which also covered Harwell and Cullum. And I can remember people telling us at the time that fusion was going to be the great hope for.
Yeah, we don't put it, and we hardly do anything on that.
Well, we do actually. So we've spent an awful lot of public money on fusion over the years.
Yeah.
And as far as I can see, back in the 1980s, we were told it was 40 years off, and it still seems to be 40 years off.
Yeah.
So
at what point have we committed $1 billion to nuclear fusion?
Well, collectively, because this is
largely
European program.
Yeah. Okay.
As a European program, we've certainly spent a lot more than that. I can assure you.
Can I just say, though, that there are clearly different stages, and thorium is one of the things that might well be interesting to look at, but it's not going to deliver functioning nuclear power plants quickly. But we are looking at our long-term research needs on nuclear. We said we do that. We've got a process to do that. And we'll look at that quite systematically. So that's how we will try and answer your question on it.
Yeah.
We're not ignoring it. We will look at it and other research needs. But the point the Secretary of State is making is it's about timescales and actually what's practical now.
And so the Wakeman report came out 7 months after Fukushima. And I'd put on record that Fukushima wasn't a nuclear accident, by the way. It was a failure of the mechanisms to defend it. It wasn't a nuclear accident, even though it's portrayed in the media as being so. Do you think that was that study by Dr. Wakeman was sufficient in depth? Are you going to do anything follow up?
No, I thought I'm not a physicist, and I'm not a scientist. As you know, I'm an economist by background, but I thought that both the interim report and the final report were very thorough pieces of work, and I was particularly pleased that after we had asked Mike Waitman to do the report, that the IAEA also asked him to lead the international study, because I think it showed the standing which he has in the international community, and it showed that we were getting a really first-rate person to do the work, and I think that it's had a very useful impact, both in highlighting some things which are uncomfortable for us, like, for example, the fact that we have to continue to work very, very hard on the ponds and silos at Sellafield, the clean-up, but it's also very clearly said that we don't need to reconsider the siting of the new nuclear reactors, nor do we have any big lessons to take away in terms of the operation of our existing nuclear fleet. And I think that was the right way to do it. It was to commission a serious expert piece of work which could look at the lessons. And there are lessons in terms of backup. You know, it's very, very clear from Dr. Waitman's report that you're absolutely right, this wasn't a nuclear accident so much as the overwhelming of backup facilities for pumping and for cooling by the tsunami. Now, we won't, I hope, have a tsunami, but we do have, for example, very intensive rainfall, which can be overwhelming, and we need to be sure that we can handle those sort of events. So that's something that's a useful check.
The final thing I'd say is that what underpins all of this is a public fear of radioactivity. And I would encourage you to perhaps get the facts out there about the reality of radioactivity in relation to health. The figures around Chernobyl are not consistent with what you would get if you stopped someone in the street. And it underpins all of our decisions in this area, because people are scared of nuclear because they think Fukushima was a nuclear accident.
Well, I think one of the advantages, frankly, of getting Mike Waitman to do that report is that the debate within the UK has been much more measured than it has been in some other countries. And I was looking recently at the polling support figures for new nuclear, which before some time ago were about 48% in favour. Just before Fukushima they were a little over 50, and they're still 48%. So there's been very little shift, in fact, in public opinion. I think that does reflect the fact that we have tried to deal with this in a measured way, which is based on the facts. My view, which I've repeatedly stated and I've said to the nuclear industry, is that the real challenge for, if nuclear is going to deliver as part of the energy mix, is that these are massive, big investment projects, and they've got to be delivered on budget and on time. Because if you're trying to get Capital Group or any of the other investors to put money in, and you run a year or 2 years over budget, you're taking a year or 2 years out of the best year or 2 years out of the return that you're expecting on your capital. And it makes a dramatic impact on the net present value. So the real challenge is, I agree with you, if you look at some of the expert work that has been done on the different health hazards from different sources of energy, clearly the one that's out there as the biggest is coal, because of atmospheric problems, because of people in, sadly, who are still suffering fatal accidents at work and so forth. And nuclear, taking account of what we know about past accidents, it does not register up in the same league. But all of these energy sources have not just risks attached, but also economic risks attached. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we continue to have a portfolio of different approaches, that we're not betting the farm on one particular technology or one particular approach or one particular view of the world, be it a low gas price view of the world or a high gas price view of the world. We need to have a framework for our energy policy that can actually adjust over time to successes, and if thorium comes on and it can be a player, then the framework that we've set out will be able to support it.